The Asian Insider panel discussion. Now, the moderator for this discussion is Nirmal Ghosh, the Straits Times US bureau chief. And our panelists are Selena Ling, head of treasury research and strategy, OCBC Bank, and member of the OCBC Wealth Panel. We also have Huang Shan, Caixin Media's deputy managing editor, Ravi Velloor, ST's associate editor, and last but certainly not least, Tan Dawn Wei, ST's China bureau chief.
This is Asian Insider and I'm Nirmal Ghosh. Now today we have a special discussion for the Straits Times 2021 Global Outlook Forum. And we have a really excellent panel to talk about the way forward for Asia and ASEAN at this particularly crucial juncture. In Singapore, we have Selena Ling, Head of Treasury Research and Strategy at the Global Treasury Division of OCBC Bank. And we have Straits Times Associate Editor Ravi Velloor. And in Beijing, we have Caixin Media Deputy Managing Editor Huang Shan and the Straits Times China Bureau Chief Tan Dawn Wei. Hello from DC, and thank you for taking the time for this. So Selena, the pandemic has exposed fault lines and also caused great and in many ways lasting economic damage. For example, the plunge in remittances, which has hurt several countries that depend on remittances. And we have new surges of the virus across the region. But with the vaccinations now beginning to roll out and countries in the region still better off than, say, the UK or the United States, do you see any reason for optimism for Singapore and for other economies in the region?
Definitely. I think there is room for optimism here. After 1 year of looking back at the COVID pandemic, I think it's fair to say that actually policymakers have thrown all resources, whether it's fiscal or monetary policy, easing at the problem. And they have cooperated to a certain extent. And I think this has, to a certain extent, mitigated some of the fallout in terms of the unemployment numbers. I think looking forward, there are a few silver linings that we can latch onto. First, as you mentioned, the vaccine has come a little earlier than expected, and the rollout is already underway in many major economies. Second, China is the first in and first out of this crisis. And China, if they have stable growth recovery this year, that would be a great source of stability and also growth demand for the region. I think third, we have also seen that Asian economies have put in place unprecedented policy support. And because policymakers are still fairly cautious, they are likely to sustain this support measures for at least a little while longer until they are very convinced that the recovery is stable and intact. And last but not least, we have also seen that for countries like Singapore that has substantial fiscal resources, actually all these rainy day savings came in very, very handy during this pandemic. Well, on the offset, actually, there are a couple of things we still have to look out for. So it's not all going to be rosy from here. I think first and foremost, we have seen that this virus is a very sneaky virus. So the news of the more virulent strains coming out suggests that it is too early to let our guard down. And I think secondly, of course, is that the earlier concerns about US-China rivalry hasn't really gone away yet. So while there are hopes that the incoming Biden administration will be a little bit less antagonistic towards China, nevertheless, we think that they will still be relatively tough on China because that's the bipartisan mood in Washington at this juncture. So that's my take on where we stand in terms of the global economy and also for Asia.
Interesting. I'm glad you mentioned the US-China rivalry because that's my next question to Huang Shan. Aside from the challenge of the pandemic, the rivalry between China and the United States is the new defining geopolitical story of our time. How confident are you, Huang Shan, that these two powers will find a way to coexist rather than, in a worst-case scenario, co-destruct?
Okay, just echoing Selena's observation, I think definitely the US-China rivalry is not going away anytime soon because the bipartisan consensus, and also a lot of anti-China sentiment is building up in Washington, D.C. So whereas in the White House, we're not trying to cause for the next, for 8 years, the Sino-US relations. Having said that, I would argue that actually, to be frank, I don't think the US-China relations actually is a top priority for both countries because for the US, I think taking on the COVID-19 and also economic recovery and also the healing, the polarization as top priority for the Biden administration. As you based in Washington, D.C., you really saw the chaos and we call the storming of Capitol Hill is really one of the darkest days in the history of United American constitutionality. So I think try to the healing the divisions and narrowing the polarization is top priority for the new administration. And also, when we talk about the Biden's foreign policy, definitely he's trying to rebuild. I would say rebuild the international alliance, particularly bring together all the Western democracies, which were actually damaged by the 4 years Trump administration. So I think the top priority is try to mend fences instead of rebuilding something. And second, I think for China, definitely, yes, China will be the first major economy which will post the positive GDP growth this year. Having said that, if you look at China's CPI, people talking about the danger of deflation here in China, and also a lot of the potential sporadic outbreak of a pandemic today in China, particularly in the winter season. So I think fighting COVID-19 and also the have sustainable economic recovery remains a top priority for China. So overall speaking, I think for both countries, focus inward looking and focusing domestic challenges are top priorities for both. And before they really can mend fences and get the house in order, I think the U.S.-China relations will, really top the both administrations' agenda.
Absolutely good points. And Joe Biden will be a crisis president from day one and has a lot to deal with on the domestic front. So Dawn, if I could bring you in, what does China want or expect or hope for from a Joe Biden administration?
Well, I think for the immediate future, China would hope for some room to breathe and for the temperature to be taken down a notch. We've seen how the past year or so, has been a relentless onslaught of provocative moves and sanctions by the Trump administration, even till now. I mean, it has in the past week continued to go after Chinese companies, banning transactions with 8 Chinese apps. And also the New York Stock Exchange's decision to delist 3 Chinese telcos. And so Beijing has been kept busy responding to these moves, threatening to retaliate and retaliating, although perhaps not quite with the same amount of force. So it would surely hope for the intensity to drop, and I think it expects it to, as the Biden administration, Huang Shan said, focuses first on getting its domestic issues in order, such as containing the COVID outbreak in the country and focusing on economic recovery. The hope is that, with a Biden administration, China would be dealing with someone who offers much more rationality and less volatility, and who will at least bring the US back to the table for talks, because the Trump administration has, especially in the past few months, essentially shut the door on dialogue. And Foreign Minister Wang Yi has, more than once held out an olive branch and urged the US to come back to the table, and even said that it was willing to discuss almost anything. But whatever China hopes and wants, it is at the same time under no illusion that Biden will reset ties or reverse course on treating China as a strategic competitor and adversary, because the previous China policy of constructive engagement, that ship has sailed. Some Communist Party insiders that we've spoken to in recent months, they said that they're not optimistic that US-China ties will be mended because the relationship has already fundamentally changed. And there are also expectations that a democratic US president will give China a hard time over human rights issues, and that, while Trump alienated his allies, Biden will likely mend those ties and plug the US back into multilateral organizations where it will play a leadership role, and also forge coalitions, possibly anti-China alliances. What was interesting was the Global Times recently did a survey that showed that nearly 2,000 Chinese citizens that were polled, out of those 2,000, 32% believe that a Biden administration would help ease the bilateral tensions, but 29% remain pessimistic, while nearly 40% thought that the situation was still unclear. So you see China embarking on a strategy of trying to win as many friends as possible. The recent investment deal with the European Union, for instance, is being seen as a strategic move by President Xi Jinping to preempt the 27 European countries from ganging up with the US. And Mr. Xi's push for this new economic strategy of self-reliance, this concept of dual circulation, is another piece of its policy in dealing with the US.
Very interesting. While we're on this the subject of geopolitics, Ravi, where does this leave ASEAN? And we hear constantly about ASEAN's centrality, but is that only lip service from the greater powers? Should ASEAN make itself more relevant?
Well, thanks for that question, Nirmal, but let me just take things back a couple of steps and talk about three strands that I think we need to keep in mind. The first being that let's just look at Joe Biden and the United States. The positive thing about the events of last week was that Mr. Trump finally conceded. And Mr. Biden has de facto control of the Senate now because of the casting vote of the vice president. So that gives him a little more elbow room to focus on foreign policy, which he was not sure of coming in. And that is a good thing for the United States. And the return to the White House of a mainline, mainstream, very normal, regular president itself is a balm, not just for the United States, but for the whole world. That's the first point. The second thing we need to keep in mind is Joe Biden and China, or the US and China. Do remember that when Mr. Biden started out in politics in 1974, the number one threat on the horizon for the United States was Russia. But things have changed substantially since then, and today the theater has moved from Central Europe to Asia. And in a way, the Russian threat of those times has mildly converged with the so-called China challenge, because the two of them are acting in concert increasingly. They are maybe not coordinating positions entirely yet, but there are close discussions. Xi Jinping and Putin just spoke just 10 days ago and reaffirmed very close ties. And Mr. Biden is not unfamiliar with China. He back in 1979 he actually met Deng Xiaoping. In 2011 and 2012, he spent considerable time with Mr. Xi Jinping when both were vice presidents. They know each other. But this Xi Jinping that Mr. Biden saw then is not the Xi Jinping of today, at least not in the global perception. And if Mr. Biden thinks that his analysis of Mr. Xi at that point contributed to a certain lowering of the United States guard, which he needs to correct now, he will come into office with that in mind. So you have to keep the Biden-China personal relations also pretty much, in your scheme of calculations when you look at that relationship. And thirdly, of course, is the ASEAN and the United States. I think Mr. Biden will be positive for Southeast Asia. At least he will not delay appointing ambassadors to the region. He will be there. He knows the region. He's been through several times. In Singapore, he knew Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. He knows the current Prime Minister. He's met them. And do remember that he was a very involved vice president. I just finished reading Barack Obama's autobiography, Promised Land. And one of the things that surprised me about it, what struck me about that book is how much he involved his vice president in the decision making. He was allowed to have a say, allowed to dissent. His views were taken into account, but Mr. Obama had the final say. So he was in the room when the pivot was fashioned by the State Department, by probably Kurt Campbell or whoever was involved. So as far as the question you asked, which is about ASEAN centrality, a lot of ASEAN centrality depends on whether ASEAN itself can stay coherent. If there is discord within ASEAN, it loses its relevance to both groups, which means it can be penetrated and split. In that case, the United States and its friends and allies around the region, which today, if you look at the Quad, there's no ASEAN centrality in the Quad. In fact, the Quad is the hemlines of Asia to contain China as it's evolving. For ASEAN to stay relevant, it has to stay coherent. And it has to show that coherence, it has to show a certain commitment to core principles, which is absolute commitment to openness, and also a commitment to insist on that countries play by the rules. If it can do that, I think ASEAN can aspire to a certain centrality. But until then, I think ASEAN centrality is really just a catchphrase, a convenient catchphrase.
Right, interesting. We'll get back to the Quad later. I'd like to get back to that. That's quite interesting. Selena, back to you for a moment. Turning to economic risk, what do you see as the most critical risks going forward for the region? And what do governments need to avoid or adapt to going forward?
Well, let me start with an analogy. 2020 was a year where effectively your house was on fire, the whole neighborhood was on fire because of the COVID pandemic. So there was a lot of firefighting that was ongoing, a lot of policy measures, a lot of collaboration between countries on supply chain disruptions and stuff like that. I think the mood in 2021 will shift away because it's more like a rebuilding process here. So the worry, of course, is that political jostling and infighting will start to reassert again. And this is very much tied up with economic risk as well. Because while policymakers are very focused on trying to boost the growth recovery story this year, will protectionism come back again? That's one concern. If you look inwards, trying to protect your own industries and your business models, will it come at the expense of the neighbors? That's something we still have to be watchful for. I think the last couple of years when US and China were, quibbling over trade, over technology, and a lot of other issues, that has cast a shadow over Asia itself. Of course, there are benefits from some of the China plus one shifts and also the global supply chain shifts. But I think generally when the two giants are kind of fighting, it does weigh on economic and sentiments and also consumer confidence. But apart from the prevailing trade or geopolitical tensions, there are also some idiosyncratic tensions that I want to highlight here. So for Malaysia, for instance, we have a fairly fractured political landscape. With UMNO, calling for snap elections, I think the political equilibrium remains fairly unstable. And I think the heightened uncertainty probably will weigh in terms of the medium-term growth prospects. For Indonesia, it's a slightly different issue. It's one of execution. They have put in place certain relatively good policies like the omnibus law that was passed last year, but they do need to get the sub-regulations in place and to ensure that execution is done properly in order to reap the full benefits of that. For Singapore, it's a totally different ballgame altogether. It's all about trying to position for a post-COVID environment. So a lot of changes to the way we live, work, and play as well. So having to adjust to work from home arrangements, businesses have to adopt e-commerce and also digital platforms. I think the window for adjusting to the pace of change has actually compressed, especially for a lot of the small and medium businesses and also for lowly skilled workers and also for gig workers and even the elderly PMETs, for instance, because they are faced with a brave new world. It's very much digital and it's a totally different model from what they are used to in their lifetime. So I think some of these structural changes, digital disruption, a very fractured tense type of political landscape. These are all interwoven into the economic risks that I see on the Asian landscape for now.
Okay, interesting. Huang Shan, what has been the response in China to the United States? First, to the Trump administration's broad policies targeting China, which you've spoken about, and more specifically, targeting the Communist Party, really, and also to rising anti-China sentiment in the United States, which you alluded to. What is the response in China to that, and do you foresee some space for compromise with a new attitude from the incoming US administration?
Well, I think definitely Chinese government is not have no any illusion that our bilateral relations will come into normal anytime soon. And when I talk about the normal, I think we really need to ask ourselves a questions that is the normal representing the normal of the past days. I mean, when we talk about maybe we need to talk about the new normal, the concept new normal. That means that actually America first and inward-looking, the sentiment and the protectionism maybe become a kind of mainstream sentiment, not just in Washington D.C. but also among a lot of capitals. Because actually, I think the pandemic, I think Singapore is a case in point. Everybody knows that Singapore is the most liberalized and open societies in the world. But the pandemic shows that actually Singapore is subject to a lot of the geopolitical, economic challenges because yes, you are one of the most open economies in the world, but when the whole world is closed, right, it's really unusual times, closed. So Singapore is really have nowhere to find alternative sources, for example, food and other essential goods. So it's really make every capital rethink upon the normal. So can we go back to the old days? I personally don't think that. So based on this context, I think we need to put all our questions in context. Maybe I think next year, I think the world will hold wait and see pattern in which everybody trying to just build their fences and make their supply chains more sustainable and more self-sufficient. Yes, we're talking about a lot of restoring and outsourcing, all these kind of things. But we always put this new concept in the context of the new normal. That means everybody feel increasing unsecure in this fragmented and rivalry world. So my think when it comes to your question, Nirmal, and I think Chinese government definitely were trying to connecting all the dots. I use the words means that when the top diplomats were sent to different countries, different continents, they try to build a kind of loose-shaped coalition as a counterpart to we call the coalition for democracies. Right? Everybody knows that the Biden administration trying to rebuild we call the transatlantic alliances and also extended to other democracies like the coalition for democracies. So as a counterpart to these the concept, I think Chinese government is trying to rebuild we call the human society with a shared destiny, right? So using the vaccine diplomacy or PP diplomacy, trying to bring together all these stakeholders within Chinese economic orbit. We know actually the Chinese, when it comes to Chinese economic might, is definitely one of the best selling points for the Chinese attractiveness. So definitely China will not hesitate to use its economic power to persuade or at least attract American like-minded countries like democracy back into Chinese economic orbit. I think definitely Southeast Asia, ASEAN is the next battleground for the US-China rivalry. And I think recently David Shambaugh, one of the top US China expert in the US, and writing a book about the next battleground for China-US rivalry is the ASEAN countries. And I really agree with Ravi's observation. To extent, the ASEAN can be a centrality and play a central role in this century. Really depends on how coherent their internal ASEAN internal political and economic dynamics. So if ASEAN is easier target for the divide and rule, or as Ravi said, it can be easily penetrated and split. I don't think ASEAN. I think the most likely scenario for the ASEAN is that it becomes the background for the great power rivalries. And so I think when it comes to the US-China relations, I think both capitals will take a holding pattern and waiting for the other party to take the initial action to view whether or not the action is benevolent or is still it's really damaging. So yeah, this is my response to your question.
That's very interesting. I'd like to bounce the ball back to Ravi for a moment, since ASEAN and being a battleground has come up. What are the pitfalls that ASEAN needs to avoid? I mean, there are deliberate efforts to split it politically by China, veer too much under the umbrella of the US. ASEAN is walking a line here. How do you see things ahead?
Well, just to go back to what Huang Shan said about David's book, it's very interesting that David Shambaugh does not say this is where Southeast Asia is where the two, China and the US clash. He said Southeast Asia's, the book's title is where the big powers meet. And I think that itself is a positive thing. I know many companies, Nirmal, who are beginning to prepare for a time when they have to live with both. I was with the CEO of the giant Pan-Asian insurance company, AIA, a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him this question. And he said, we are having a presence in the Chinese cloud, and we also have a presence in the Western or the American cloud. So people are adjusting for a situation where, they have to coexist with both. I think that's very sensible. On the whole, I think ASEAN does benefit from spills from this geopolitical contest because clearly every big corporation in the world that's in China today has a China plus strategy, and ASEAN is gaining from it. At the moment, it's a bit uneven because the manufacturing is largely going to Vietnam. Some of it is spilling into Malaysia and possibly Thailand. And a lot of the logistics and the digital thing is moving to Singapore. You've seen ByteDance come here. There's a very interesting Chinese company called Envision, which hasn't got the attention it deserves. Envision Digital is today based in Singapore, at least the global headquarters. And it's a company of the future. Very much in clean energy and everything else. So there is that spillover. But if things really go south with the big relationship, which is the US and China, then ASEAN will get affected because willy-nilly you'll be asked to choose sides. And that is a fear that cannot be wished away. It is real. As long as the big two manage their competition and rivalry with reasonable care, I think ASEAN has a good spot. I would even call it a sweet spot. But if things go really bad, people will be asked to choose sides, and I fear that might come. Already this talk of a coalition of democracies, I'm not sure it's something that's really that good for ASEAN, because at some point you have to decide whether you're part of that team or not. A lot of people underestimate the United States resolve. Nirmal, you covered the Philippines and you were based there as our correspondent. I'm sure you're aware that back in 1900, and Shambaugh speaks about it in his book, 2/3 of the United States Army was based in the Philippines to control what was seen at point as a Philippine insurrection, because the Philippines was an American colony at that point. I'd never wish I'd never underestimate the U.S. Resolve to stay engaged in this region and to keep it open. But if there are attempts to, for instance, if there's a bad start, let's say China announces an ADIZ for the South China Sea the way it did for the East China Sea, or the Sea of Japan as the Japanese call it, I think there could be real trouble. But I hope there's restraint on both sides. I have a feeling that if President Xi reaches out to President Biden, he will, for a good conversation, I think Mr. Biden will not be impatient. He will listen to Mr. Xi, and I think some good could come out of it. But as it was said earlier in this program, there's now today bipartisan thinking in the United States that China is not just a rival, but it's almost taking on the dimensions of an enemy state. And that's something that makes me worry a lot. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Dawn, there was this wonderful story about 2-3 weeks ago about the US, Australia, and China collaborating in a very challenging rescue operation in Antarctica. And there was a flurry of reports saying this is wonderful because they're putting their rivalries aside and so forth, and it shows what these countries can do if they cooperate on issues of international concern, emergencies, and so forth. What is the scope for the US and China to work together on global issues like health and climate change? Climate change being very much at the center of the new administration in Washington. So this is what the Biden administration wants, to find areas of cooperation. Of course, it doesn't depend only on the US, because the US sees China as provocative in some respects. But is there space for the two powers to find a balance and work together?
Yeah, I do think that the Chinese leadership has been pretty clear in signaling its desire to work with the US. And the narrative it has put out about this has been pretty consistent. China is not interested in being a hegemon. There are no winners in a tech or a trade war. It is far better for the US and China to cooperate. And it is, in fact, that the US has been the one who has been unreasonably provocative and bent on trying to block China's development and rise. When the COVID outbreak hit the US, China tried to convince Trump that it wants to help it deal with the crisis, and that the two countries should collaborate in a response to the pandemic. And again, recently, when it successfully collected lunar samples on its Chang'e 5 mission, it offered to share that with other countries, including the US, as a matter of goodwill. So there definitely have been overtures on the part of China. The challenge is how to overcome this level of mistrust, that the US has about China, enough for the two sides to be able to come together and work together in a constructive manner. And you mentioned climate change. I think for climate change, it would be interesting to see if the two powers can cooperate, or will it, yet be another arena for competition? Because if you recall, President Xi has pledged that China will become carbon neutral by 2060, and it is certainly positioning itself as a global leader in climate issues and green technology.
So Huang Shan, if I could get to you for a moment, China's been on a bit of a charm offensive, right? We saw vaccine diplomacy, and we are seeing Africa diplomacy as well. Is this in response to the negativity that China has been facing on several fronts?
Definitely. If you look at the past year, China's diplomatic, foreign policy, foreign environment, you can see China is really feel a lot of the negative responses among different countries, because I think it's really has something to do with China's domestic development, and also what people describe as a warrior diplomacy, and also the increasing acceptance on diplomatic fronts. So I think definitely it's subject to different interpretations, no doubt about this. But why I want to point out is that if we look at the reality is that China is feeling increasingly isolated or estranged within some capitals. That's really paved the way for the upcoming Biden administration to forge ahead with the idea of democracy, coalition for democracies. So I think with that in mind, in Beijing's mind, I think definitely Chinese top diplomats will do their best trying to attract back the hearts of those exchanged capitals. So having said that, I would say if you look at the recent Chinese diplomatic initiatives like the PPE diplomacy or vaccine diplomacy, and also the Chinese promise, echo Dawn's observation, China promised to trying to be very aggressive in climate change. And I think the climate change is really a crown jewel, particularly when it comes to the EU capitals. So we know why both sides, I mean, European and China can sign a deal about the bilateral investment treaty. I think one of the tailwind for the signing of this bilateral investment treaty is that China's commitment to fighting climate change and announcing very aggressive carbon dioxide reduction target. So because this is really one of the crown jewel treasured by particularly French President Macron, and because we know that actually with upcoming step down of the Chancellor Merkel in Germany, so Macron will be the also I think the leader of the continental Europe against backdrop of Brexit. So, and also another thing is about the recent announcement of a Chinese new ambassador to UK. So, who was said to be actually the Chinese ambassador to the United States. So he actually is a specialist in US instead of the UK and the European affairs. I think by rerouting Chinese original appointment to Washington to now London really represent the Chinese the broader mindset when it comes to it's called the Trump offensive, because we really want to have some very high senior high level diplomat to appoint as the appointment can really using their expertise to attract back the minds and hearts of different capitals. They really, at least by neutralize those potentially democratic partners of the Biden administration.
Okay, so we have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to get back to you, Selena, because you mentioned protectionism earlier. Very quickly, should we worry about rising nationalism and protectionism? Because the two go hand in hand, and we're seeing rising nationalism all over the place, right?
Well, it is quite logical that during a healthcare pandemic and an economic crisis that you see protectionism and nationalism rising. I think it will still be a concern going forward for a couple of reasons. If you look back in history, economic protectionism has always accompanied nationalism. But economic nationalism doesn't necessarily mean it has to be protectionist. I think the problem really started when you have the champion of free trade, which is the US, actually take protectionism to a new level with its America First strategy. So not just tariffs, but also economic sanctions and investment bans, etc. So that has really changed the ballgame altogether. Just look at the recent U-turns by NYSE, whether to delist the 3 Chinese companies. So all the investors are now asking who will be next. I think if you look within Asia itself, resource nationalism is also a growing concern for countries like Indonesia. They are trying to push their mining sector players to upgrade and move up the value chain and to export processed goods instead of raw materials. So the good news is they are trying to bring in new players like Tesla, to invest in battery production, and that will hopefully leverage on their very substantial nickel deposits. So I'm a firm believer, that the economic pendulum will always swing. So what we saw in the past was globalization, free trade agreements was the in thing, and then we had this swing towards some pushback and protectionist measures. Well, if you look at the glass half full, actually think about it. When the US withdrew from the TPP, actually that have lent some impetus for the like-minded countries to actually form the RCEP. So my wish is that really cooler heads will still prevail, and that this rising tide of nationalism and protectionism hopefully will change with the new Biden administration, and also that the rest of the world would continue to see the benefits of globalization and free trade.
Ravi, I'll give you the parting shot, 30 seconds. Should we worry about protectionism and nationalism?
I think protectionism and nationalism are factors and features that everybody should worry about all the time, even in the best of times. These are counterproductive. They don't really work for anybody. But I'm completely with Selena in what she just said, that there have been episodes in history when these things have waxed and waned. I mean, the world was quite an open place a century ago, but then walls came up, and then globalization became a big feature in the 70s and 80s. The pushback we are seeing is because globalization did not work for everybody, and there are genuine concerns, even in the United States, about big sections of the US, the Rust Belt, that had suffered from this. There are big countries in Asia like Indonesia and India that think that they own the big markets, and therefore the others are obliged to accommodate them more than they need to accommodate the other side. So these trends are ongoing, but I draw comfort from the fact that, as Selena said, although the US stayed out of TPP, there was a CPTPP fashioned in Asia by Japan. Likewise, in November, we saw the RCEP being signed, maybe not a very high quality agreement the way the CPTPP is, but it's a move forward and it's a positive thing. And I wouldn't be surprised if, once he settles down, Mr. Biden looks for ways to re-engage Asia through some sort of modified TPP. He may not want to call it that, but he's already appointed a top trade person to look at that account. On the whole, I would think that I'm positive on open borders. You just saw that Hyundai has set up the electrical vehicle factory in Singapore, of all places. They could have done it in their home base, but they chose to do it here because they see value in this region being open, and that they can service the whole region from a tiny spot in Singapore, which doesn't have a big domestic market. These are positive signs for globalization, for openness, for trade, and I think I draw comfort from that. Thank you.
Excellent, very good. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. Ravi, Selena, Huang Shan, Dawn, thank you very much for being on Asian Insider today. Asia and ASEAN are at a critical juncture. There's a change of guard imminent in Washington, D.C., and the COVID-19 pandemic is still very much with us. Adaptation and economic fundamentals are very much top of mind in many countries in the region. That was a special edition of Asian Insider for the 2021 Straits Times Global Outlook Forum, and I'm Nirmal Ghosh.